A man named Darnell had been sleeping in his car with his 2 children for almost a year. Parked most nights within sight of a demolition yard, nobody bothered to fence properly. His kids knew every landmark on that block. They knew which gas station let them use the bathroom before school, which trash pile in the yard was just junk, and which pile, the curved steel panel stacked behind a torn-down warehouse, what he built out of it, using nothing but a borrowed welder and YouTube tutorials, would eventually be filmed, shared, and seen by hundreds of thousands of strangers. But what happened after the video spread, when the city showed up with a clipboard instead of congratulations, is a part that made his own neighbors furious enough to stand between him and a code enforcement officer's car. To understand how a father ends up building his children's home out of scrap steel, you first need to understand exactly how many families are living the way Darnell was, and why almost nobody is watching for them. More than 650,000 people experience homelessness on a single night across the country, according to the most recent federal count, and families with children made up a significant share of that number. Single fathers raising kids alone, while homeless rarely show up in that conversation at all. No campaign is built around them. No shelter photo features them. They are, in almost every data set that exists, an afterthought. In the county where Darnell lived, school district records showed more than 3,000 children were homeless or unstably housed, sleeping in cars, motels, or doubled up with relatives who barely had room for their own kids. Darnell's 2 children were 2 of those numbers, though no spreadsheet ever recorded what that actually looked like at 7 in the morning, using a car side mirror to get a child ready for school. Local shelters were full more nights than not. Wait lists for family housing assistance stretched past a year in some cases. And scattered across the city, the demolition sites and scrapyards most people drove past without a second glance had quietly become something else. Places where people with nowhere else to turn went looking for material nobody else wanted. You have probably driven past one of those sites yourself, without knowing what was quietly being built behind the fence. While the city debated multi-year housing plans still waiting on state funding, men like Darnell weren't waiting on anyone. They were teaching themselves to weld from phone videos, borrowing tools from anyone who would lend them, and turning discarded steel into 4 walls and a locked door. What happened next would turn one father's quiet project into something the entire city ended up talking about, for reasons that had nothing to do with charity. The man at the center of the story was Darnell Whitfield, 34 years old, a former warehouse forklift operator who lost his job when his shift was cut entirely during a round of layoffs. Within 4 months, he'd fallen behind on rent, then lost the apartment. He and his 2 children, Marcus and Ava, spent the next several months cycling between his sister's overcrowded apartment, a friend's garage, and eventually his car. Darnell knew the demolition site off Grand Avenue, the way most locals did, as a place you ignored. A warehouse that had been torn down a year before, and the crew doing the teardown had left behind a stack of curved steel panels, leftover siding from an old military surplus Quonset structure, too heavy and too awkward for scrapyard to haul off quickly. He noticed it on a Tuesday morning, dropping his kids at school. That same afternoon, he asked the site foreman if he could take what was left. The foreman shrugged and told him to take as much as he wanted. Nobody else had asked. The moment that actually changed things wasn't dramatic at all. It was Ava, in the back seat of the car, asking when they were going to have a real room again. That question sat with him for 2 days. Then he started hauling steel. He had no truck, so he borrowed one from a co-worker on weekends. He had no welding experience, so he taught himself from phone videos in gas station parking lots between shifts. He had no money for a rail foundation, so he leveled the ground himself with a rented tamper and gravel bought a few bags at a time. What he did have was a reason that got him up before sunrise every single day, and a stack of steel nobody else wanted badly enough to take first. By the end of that first week, he had cleared enough panels to see the outline of something. Not a shelter, not a tent, the beginning of an actual home, if he could keep it standing long enough to finish it. Building with scrap steel is nothing like building with lumber. Every panel Darnell hauled home was bent in a different place, rusted through in another, and none of it came with instructions. He worked mostly at night, after picking up his kids, laying panels out under shop lights rigged off a car battery. The curved steel had to be cut down with an angle grinder, then fitted and welded seam by seam, a process that ate up most of a week just to frame the base. His hands paid for it first. By the second week, they were raw and blistered, wrapped in electrical tape, because he couldn't afford gloves that actually fit the work. He burned through 2 pairs of cheap safety glasses. More than once, a panel shifted wrong and nearly came down on him. Neighbors near the site noticed before anyone official did. Some assumed it was a shed or scrap for resale and moved on. One older man told him flatly that the city would tear it down the moment they noticed, that nobody was allowed to just build whatever they wanted on land like that. Darnell kept working anyway. Money ran out faster than steel did. Real insulation cost more than the panels themselves had, and for nearly 2 weeks the shell of the structure sat half-finished, framed but hollow, while he picked up extra shifts trying to close the gap. Whether he could finish before the weather turned was still an open question. Whether anyone from the city had already clocked what was rising a few blocks from downtown was another one entirely, and he wouldn't get an answer to either for several more weeks. Then, on a Saturday, a co-worker who'd heard what he was doing showed up with a truck bed full of leftover foam board from a construction job, material that would have gone in a dumpster otherwise. He didn't ask for anything in return. He unloaded it and left. That single delivery changed the timeline entirely. For the first time since he'd started, Darnell believed he might actually finish before the cold set in, and finish it in a way his kids would be proud to call home. A neighbor filmed him one evening without asking. Just a short clip of Darnell welding a seam by work light, sparks flying against the curved steel wall behind him. She posted it with a caption calling him the hardest working man on the block. Within 3 days, the clip had over 800,000 views. Comments flooded in from people who had never met him. Strangers offered tools. A local hardware store owner reached out and offered leftover insulation and 2 rolls of vapor barrier for free. A retired electrician named Ruben saw the video, drove out unannounced, and asked if Darnell needed help running wiring safely. He stayed for the next 3 weekends. A GoFundMe someone else set up on his behalf, without him even knowing at first, raised just over $9,000 in 11 days. With that support, what had started as a bare steel shell began turning into something else entirely. Darnell used part of the money for real spray foam insulation instead of the scavenged foam board. He added a small solar setup, 2 panels, and a deep cycle battery, enough to run lights and charge phones. He framed out a sleeping loft for the kids and built a narrow kitchenette against one curved wall. Salvaged cabinets sanded down and repainted. What had been survival was becoming something closer to a real home, insulated and painted steel walls, a working door with an actual lock, windows pulled from a renovation site and reset into steel-cut frames. Not everyone watching was impressed for the right reasons. A few comments under the video asked whether the structure was even legal, whether anyone had checked it for safety, whether the city knew it existed at all. Darnell didn't have answers to those questions yet. He was focused on one thing only, getting his kids somewhere warm before the first cold snap hit, somewhere low to ground, and belonging to nobody but them. He had no way of knowing those exact questions about permits, about legality, about who gets to decide what a family is allowed to live in, were already on their way to his front door. 6 weeks after he first started hauling steel, Darnell opened the door of the finished structure and let his children walk in first. Ava went straight for the sleeping loft. Climbing the short ladder he'd welded into wall himself, and called down that she could see out the round window at the end of the curved ceiling. Marcus stood in the middle of the main room for a long moment before saying anything, just running his hand along the smooth, painted steel wall. The finished home measured just under 400 square feet, built entirely from reclaimed Quonset panels, insulated with donated spray foam, and painted a deep, warm blue. Darnell had mixed himself from leftover cans a hardware store was ready to throw out. Inside sat a small kitchenette with a 2-burner propane stove, a compact bathroom with a composting toilet, and a sleeping loft above a main room that doubled as living space in Darnell's own bed at night. 2 solar panels on the curved roof at a battery bank that kept the lights on and phones charged without a single utility bill. A small wood stove, vented properly through the steel roof, would carry them through the coldest nights without depending on anyone. Total cost, once every material and hour was accounted for, came out to just under $6,800. Most of that came from GoFundMe donations and the scrap steel itself, valued at nothing. since it had been headed for a landfill before Darnell got to it. Ava taped a crayon drawing to the inside of the front door on the first night. The three of them standing in front of a blue house with the sun overhead. Darnell left it there. He said later it was the first thing he wanted to see every time he walked in. For the first time in over a year, his children had beds in a room that belonged to them, with a door that locked from inside and windows that looked out onto something other than a parking lot or a fogged-up car window. What he'd built out of steel other people had already decided was worthless now stood as a fully functioning home. And what it cost him, in dollars and in months of his own labor, was about to be measured against something far larger, run by people with far more money, and far less to show for it. The city Darnell lived in had spent $42 million over 3 years on a rapid rehousing initiative built to get families off the street and into stable units. According to the city's own year-end report, just over half of the families placed through that program were still housed 12 months later. The rest cycled back into shelters, doubled-up living situations, or the street. Darnell built a fully insulated, solar-powered home with a working kitchen, bathroom, and sleeping loft for $6,800, using steel that was already headed for a landfill. That contrast alone should tell you everything you need to know. But the city wasn't finished yet. Roughly 2 weeks after the video went viral, a code enforcement officer showed up at the site with a clipboard and a notice. The structure, she said, had no permit, no inspection, and sat on land that hadn't been cleared for residential use. She posted a notice giving Darnell 30 days to bring it up to code or vacate entirely. A spokesperson for the building department later told a local reporter that the department understood the intent behind the project, but that safety codes existed for a reason, and that unpermitted structures created liability the city could not simply overlook, regardless of the circumstances that led to them. Keep in mind, this was the same city that had watched more than 1,000 people sleep in doorways and along the river most nights, while its own $42 million plan sat behind schedule and over budget. The notice went up on a Thursday. By Saturday, a news crew was parked outside the site, and Darnell's neighbors, the same ones who'd once wondered if the city would tear it down, were now standing between his door and the officer's car. Public reaction was immediate and loud. Comments under the department's own social media posts ran overwhelmingly against them, many pointing to the exact numbers now circulating online. $42 million, a 50% failure rate, and one father's $6,800 solution sitting a few miles away. Within a week, under mounting pressure, the city quietly extended Darnell's compliance window to 90 days and assigned an inspector to help bring the structure up to legal standard instead of condemning it outright. It wasn't a full victory, but for the first time in this entire process, the system had bent toward him instead of the other way around. And what came next would prove that bend was just a beginning. Darnell's story did not stay contained to one city, and what happened next is where things started moving faster than even he expected. About 400 miles away, in a mid-sized town in Ohio, a single father named Terrence Boyd saw the video and reached out directly, asking how Darnell had sourced the steel and handled the welding. Terrence had been living with his teenage son in a converted utility trailer for nearly a year, using scrap panels from a shutter manufacturing plant, and guidance Darnell gave him over video calls. Terrence finished his own 320-square-foot steel home in under 2 months for a total cost of $5,200. In a rural county in Georgia, a nonprofit called Second Foundation Builders noticed both stories and launched a small pilot program pairing homeless parents with retired contractors willing to volunteer weekends. Their first completed project, a curved steel home for a mother of 3, cost just under $8,000 and took 6 weeks from foundation to move in. A Boy Scout troop in that same county, after hearing about the project on local news, spent a Saturday building and donating raised garden beds to the family's new yard, along with a hand-painted sign nailed to the fence post. This house is loved. Back in his own city, Darnell had quietly become a resource himself. He started fielding messages from other single parents asking the same questions Terrence once had, about welding, about insulation, about where to find steel nobody else wanted. He had no nonprofit, no formal program. He had a phone number he gave out freely, and a Saturday morning, he was usually willing to spend teaching someone else how to cut a panel straight. By the time reporters circled back 6 months later, Darnell's own home was fully up to code, inspected and approved. The 90-day compliance window closed out well ahead of schedule. Marcus had started asking to help with the welding himself. Ava's crayon drawing was still taped to the door, a little more faded, exactly where she'd left it. What began as one man refusing to let his kids sleep in a car had, in under a year, quietly become a small, unfunded network stretching across 3 states, one family at a time, one pile of forgotten steel at a time. But the same zoning laws and permitting delays that nearly cost Darnell his own home were still standing in the way of almost everyone trying to follow him. And that fight was far from over. Zoning codes in most American cities were written decades before anyone imagined a family living safely inside a repurposed steel structure on a residential lot. Building departments still classify homes like Darnell's under rules meant for backyard sheds, rules that were never written with a father and his 2 children in mind. In the county where Terrence built his home, the permitting process is supposed to take 90 days on paper. In practice, residents who've gone through it say it regularly stretches past a year. A determined man can frame, insulate, and finish an entire steel home in 6 weeks. Getting the government's permission to legally live in it can take 10 times as long. That gap between how fast a person can build and how slowly a system can approve it sits at the center of everything this movement keeps running into. On one side, fathers like Darnell and Terrence, spending their own money and their own blister hands to give their kids a locked door and a warm floor. On the other, departments and budgets that move slowly, spend enormously, and still produce results worse than what one man and a stack of scrap steel managed in under 2 months. Darnell still lives in that same curved steel home with Marcus and Ava. The compliance notice that once threatened to take it from him now sits folded in a drawer, a reminder instead of a threat. Ava's crayon drawing is still on the door. Marcus talks about becoming a welder himself one day. There are still hundreds of thousands of families across this country tonight with nowhere solid to sleep, still waiting on programs that move slower than the problem they're meant to solve. But somewhere in Ohio, a teenage boy is falling asleep in a steel-walled room his father built with his own hands. Somewhere in Georgia, a mother of 3 is watching her kids water a garden a group of Boy Scouts built for a family they'd never met. And somewhere in the same city, a man who once had nothing but a pile of steel nobody wanted now has a home nobody can take away. Maybe that has always been the answer. Not a bigger budget, not a longer plan, just one father, refusing to let his children sleep outside one more night than they had to. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. I cover people like this every week, the ones quietly solving problems the rest of us just talk about. And the video on your screen right now picks up exactly where this one leaves off. I'll see you there.